So what's it like when you use wild cards in your poker games? Well, compare it to an evening that looks like this. To one that looks like this. Stay tuned just to see how wild cards can get in your poker games. Welcome back to Backyard Poker, everyone, the channel dedicated to expanding your poker palette beyond just Texas Hold'em. I'm Ryan, your host, and I'm excited to talk about the use of wild cards in your backyard poker games. This is part 7 of my Poker Basics series, so if you're new to poker, I highly recommend you check out parts 2, 3, 5, and 6 of my Poker Basics series before continuing here. Texas Hold'em players familiar with poker hand ranks can skip part 2. I'll leave the links in the description below. Okay, so what will I be discussing in this video? Well, first I'll talk about the controversy surrounding using wild cards in poker. I'll explain what a wild card is and how it affects your poker hand. I'll also show a special poker hand rank that is only possible when you use wild cards. I'll show a few special cards that can be used as wild. Then I'll show some not so obvious sample hands where the wild cards can change your poker hand drastically. Then there's a few rules I'll compare when using wildcard and non-wildcard hands. And lastly, I'll show a few poker variant games that use wildcards in a fun and creative way. It won't take long after discussing and playing poker with others that the debate comes up about whether wildcards should even be used in the game of poker. Some people believe that wildcards are gimmicks and take away from the game, and make it less of a skill-based game and more of a luck-based game. Because of how much wild cards can actually change a person's hand, there might be some merit to this. And you can certainly go overboard with using too many wild cards in a game. On the other hand, wild cards can create some excitement and variety for a full night of poker. It tends to keep players in the game longer, which is important for low-stake games. And let's keep that in mind. The backyard poker style is meant to be fun and entertaining, as well as skillful. Personally, I like the use of wildcards, and so do most of my poker buddies. There's plenty of times where using wildcards has created some fun and exciting outcomes. Be prepared, however, for some hosts to not allow or severely restrict the use of wildcards as part of their house rules. House rules and poker etiquette will be discussed in part 10 of this Poker Basics series. Be sure to respect the host's rules. Even if wildcards are allowed, don't push it if too many people are complaining about it. The key rule is everyone having fun, even playing these wildcard games? Well, then go for it. Now let's go bird's eye with the camera and see these wildcards in action. Okay, so now you may be wondering, what exactly is a wild card and what's so special about it? Well, simply put, a wild card is a predefined card that can be used to represent any card you want to improve your hand. Okay, so which cards are wild then? That is what the dealer decides when he announces the game to be played. There are a few ways wild cards can be called in a poker game. I group them into what I call direct and indirect ways. Let's look at the direct way of calling wildcards first. A direct way of establishing wildcards is to name a single or group of cards as always being wild for every player. For example, the dealer may announce, okay, the game is 7-card stud, deuces wild. That means that all the deuces or twos in the poker deck are wild cards. Some other dealer may say, 5-card stud, man with the axe is wild. Man with the axe?
Here's Johnny.
No, not that guy. The man with the axe is the king of diamonds. See that little axe there? Here's a few more colorful names for some of the other court cards. The Suicide King. See how it looks like the king is stabbing himself in the head with his sword? One-eyed jacks. 2 of the 4 jacks only show one eye, the Jack of Hearts and the Jack of Spades. So some dealer may announce, 5-card draw, one-eyed jacks and the man with the axe are wild. So that would be the Jack of Spades, the Jack of Hearts, and the King of Diamonds as wild cards. And now we come to jokers.
Me?
Most poker decks come with 2 jokers that are usually set aside and not used for most poker games. A dealer could use one or both joker cards as wild cards. For the examples I'll show next, I'll use the 2 joker cards as wild cards to make it easier to recognize. Here's a real simple one. As you can see here, the player has 4 normal cards plus the 1 joker, which is wild. As I mentioned, the wild card can represent any 1 card you want to give you a better poker hand rank. Since the highest of the 4 other cards is an ace, the joker can act as a second ace and have your hand rank actually be a pair of aces. Let's say this is your hand instead. With a pair of aces already in the player's hand, the joker becomes the 3rd ace, and the actual poker rank is 3 of a kind or trip aces. Now let's swap out another card. With 2 wild cards, you can have 2 representations of a desired card. So here, these jokers can both become aces, and now you have a 4 of a kind or quad aces. Let's do one more hand swap in this example. Here, with these 3 aces and 2 wild cards, we actually have a special hand rank I mentioned in part 2 of my basic series called 5 of a kind. This actually beats a royal flush, and 5 aces is the highest poker hand you can achieve in a wild card poker game. Looking at the example hand here, we don't have to worry about drawing to an inside straight, because thanks to the wild card, we already have a complete straight. The wild card can be the queen needed to complete the 9 through king straight. As with straights, the wild card can be the 5th suited card to complete a flush as shown here. So for this hand, at first glance, you may think that the wild cards give this player a flush jack high, but it actually gives him a straight flush since the 2 wild cards can represent the 8 and 9 of diamonds to complete the straight flush. So this would be 7, 8, 9, 10, Jack of diamonds, a straight flush in diamonds, jack high. See how wild things can get with wild cards? One exception to the rule about a wild card representing any card you wish is when non-wild card hands are compared to hands with wild. So as you can see here, player 1 has a wild card and completes his flush so that he has a flush jack high. Player 2 has a flush in hearts, but has a queen high. Since the highest natural card from player 2's hand is a queen, and player 1 is only a jack, player 2 would actually win this poker game with a queen high flush. This rule applies to straights and straight flushes as well. For matching cards, there's more of a chance of ties occurring. In these cases, wild cards are treated the same way as non-wild cards. So in the example here, we have 3 of a kind 10s with wild, and we have 3 of a kind 10s with no wild. We have a 2 and a 4 in the top hand, a 2 and the 4 in the bottom hand. These would be considered tied poker hands, and the players would split the pot. So all of the examples above used a fixed card designation. In that case, the joker. But there are games that are indirect in how wild cards are established. There are practically endless ways to indirectly declare wild cards, so I'll list a few of the common ones. Number 1 is card after. Some games, usually stud-type game variants, will have the card after the name card be wild. An example is Chase the Queen, which is a game I'll explain later in this video. This game has any card after the queen turned up become wild. So in this example, the queen, the 4 would become wild. Number 2, hole cards. Another stud-style variant has each player have their own personal wild card. Another game I'll explain later in this video is low hole. That's where each player's lowest card in the hole, or face down, is wild. So for this player here, the 4 would be wild since that's his lowest hole card. All poker games using wild cards have the same structure, dealing, and betting as non-wild card games, so I won't go through all these games step by step as in my previous Poker Basics videos. Instead, I'll just focus on the ways wild cards are established in these games. This first example will be 7-card stud, but with a wild card that will be used. The dealer could just name a card value to be wild, like 6s, but I'm going to be a little bit more creative. I'm going to use my custom poker die I created just for poker games like this. Check out my poker dice video to see more info on these. The link will be in the description below. So just before dealing the cards, I'll roll this 10-sided die to determine what will be wild for that game. And it's deuces, so 2s will be wild for this game. Then I would play 7-card stud, and any 2s in the hole or face up will be wild. So as I mentioned before, you can have indirect wild card declarations in your game. The example I showed was Chase the Queen. This is another 7-card stud game, but the wild card assignment only happens if a queen is turned up when the face-up cards are dealt. So for this example here, player 1 was just dealt a queen. So the next card dealt face-up will be wild. And it is the deuce. So all 2s as of now are wild. But what gives this game an interesting twist is if another queen turns up, like this one. Now the wild card changes from the 2 to a 7. So each instance of a queen changes the wild card for the game. So what happens if the last up card dealt is a queen? Well, there's a few options that the dealer should have declared when he announced the game. One is to turn over an extra card to determine the wild. In this case, it would be 10s. Or just have all the wild cards nullified and nothing's wild. Or maybe you could have the queens be wild. It's really up to the dealer to decide. Another indirect wild card game I mentioned before was Low Hole. Low Hole is another 7-card stud game in which each player's lowest card in the hole or face down is wild. So in this example here, where 6 cards of the stud game have been dealt out, player 4 has the deuce or 2 as his lowest hole card. So 2s would be wild for him. And even with that, he's still only looking at a pair of kings. Player 1 has the 3 as his lowest hole card, so 3s would be wild. And player 1 is looking at a pair of aces. Player 2 has the queen as the low card, so queens are wild for that player. So player 2 has a pair of aces as well. Player 3 has 10s as his lowest card, so 10s are wild for that player. And player 3 has a straight queen high. 8, 9, 10, jack, queen. So the straight would exist even without using it as a wild card. Now remember, in 7-card stud, the last card is dealt down, so that could potentially change the wild card. In this case, I'll deal it up just so everybody can see the card. So this doesn't change the wild card for player 1, but it does give him 3 4s. For player 2, it also doesn't change the wild card. Queens are still wild, but it gives him 3 kings. Player 3, 6s are now wild instead of the 10. But this doesn't change much, and he still has a queen high straight. And then finally, the dealer gets a 6, which doesn't change his wild card. It's still the 2. And with that 6, with that card, he has a straight 8 high. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Almost a straight flush, but not quite. One last thing about wild cards is their value by themselves. In this 7-card stud game that I'm starting here, we'll say that 9s are wild. When determining who has the highest hand showing for betting, what is the value of the wild card by itself? Well, different house rules could be used for this. The most common is that the card is its original value until a non-wild card is added to the hand. So this 9 would just be a 9, and the queen here would actually be the highest hand showing and start the betting. Other house rules would say it's an ace until other cards are added to the hand. Another house rule is that they have no value until a non-wild card is dealt to the player. So you can probably see just how wild cards can be in your poker games. Just keep in mind that wild cards allow players to have higher poker ranks, so make sure you adjust your betting and folding accordingly. There are many more poker variations using wild cards that I'll show in future videos. For now, in the description, I'll add 2 links for the 2 games that I explained today, Chase the Queen and Low Hole. Now on to the question of the day. What is your opinion about using wild cards in poker? Leave a comment below. The next part in my Poker Basics video series, Part 8, we'll talk about how you can have more than one winner in a poker game by using split pot variations. If you enjoyed this video, click the like button. If you're enjoying this series, click the subscribe button. If you're eager for new videos, click the bell icon. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.
Breath mint.
Quaalude.